Hello, boys and girls. Today we're going to talk a little bit about dialogue and how to properly format dialogue in your paper. Again, one of the things we're looking for in your paper is that you include at least one or two lines of dialogue. And so today's lesson will make sure that you are formatting it properly and that you're using it in the proper fashion. First of all, let's talk a little bit about some of the reasons why someone would use dialogue. And first of all, dialogue adds more detail to a story. When you can actually hear what a character is saying, it's going to help your reader better understand what's happening in the scene. It also helps you relive a scene. This paper is meant to be a snapshot of something that has happened to you in the past, and so included in that snapshot is some audio or some dialogue or some things that people actually said. And so that can really help your reader understand what's happening when you're reliving that scene. Dialogue can also reveal information about the reader, about a character's traits. Again, we talked a little bit about showing and not telling, and we'll talk a little bit more tomorrow on that. But revealing some traits are basically the way that a character speaks can really tell you a lot about a character. If a character is always yelling, you can probably mean that they're angry. If a character is always very sad sounding, you can probably think that they might be depressed or something. So we have a few rules for writing dialogue. The first of which, obviously, is that you have to make sure you put quotation marks around dialogue. So anything a character says should be put in quotation marks. And we have to make sure it's just that. So whenever we say things like screamed the crowd or said Johnny, those are not included in the quotation marks. The quotation marks signify to our readers what is actually being said. Next rule has to do with punctuation. So there's a couple things that we have to worry about with regards to punctuation. First of all, when you have a sentence, and it's a short sentence and it's followed by the dialogue tag, which is this area right here, Mr. Huff snapped, is what's known as a dialogue tag. When you have that, you have to precede it, or what happens before it is what you put a comma. So get to work, Mr. Huff snapped. Again, get to work is what he actually said, so those are going to be in quotation marks. We are going to put a comma there, and then put the dialogue tag. Even though that is a sentence that would probably end in a period, it is not the end of that particular sentence, so we have to make sure we put a comma. And again, that is going to go inside of the quotation marks. Now, if your quote happens to end the sentence, your period is going to go right before the quotation mark. Now, there are a couple exceptions to this rule, but we're not going to talk about those quite yet. Let's take a look over here at rule number 2. Rule number 2 has to do with other punctuation marks, such as the exclamation mark or the question mark. If you have a sentence that is the entire sentence, the dialogue, this is awesome. If you have an exclamation point like we do in this sentence right here, then you're going to put that inside the quotation marks. There is not a need for a comma in this situation because you're signifying to your reader that person's sentence is over. And you will actually have a period at the end there too. Also, if the character is asking a question, you are going to use a question mark before the quotation marks. Rule number 3 has to do with paragraphing and indenting. So each time a new character speaks, you are going to create a new paragraph. This is extremely important because sometimes you are not using dialogue tags, and so you have to make sure you are signifying to your reader a new speaker is talking. Otherwise, you have what's known as a character clash, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. So I have an example here. This one says, "This is a major grade," said Mr. Stegman through gritted teeth. "It is worth 100 points." Mr. Stegman has said these two things here. And so we have a new character speaking, so we have to start a new paragraph. "We know," Johnny said, rolling his eyes. Mr. Stegman watched as his students finally settled down to work, no doubt crafting masterpieces. And we have Mr. Stegman speaking again, so we have to start a new paragraph. "Don't forget, your rough draft is due Friday," Mr. Stegman said as his students exited for the weekend. You can see that even though this is only one sentence, this one's only 2 sentences, this is only 1 sentence, even if it is 1 sentence, even if it's only 1 word, we are still going to start a new paragraph when somebody new speaks. So we're going to try this one together. We're going to make sure we're adding some quotation marks. We're going to add some punctuation. We are going to make sure that we have a paragraph whenever someone new is speaking. So let's read through this. It says, "Mr. Stegman said, today we will talk about dialogue. We can't wait." The students cheered. Well, Mr. Stegman grinned. Let's get started. So let's take a look over here. We have our first sentence. Mr. Stegman said, "Today we will talk about dialogue." So it looks like that's what I said. So again, when we talked about capitalization before, it looks like this is the first thing that I'm saying, so I have to make sure that this letter is capitalized right here. So I'm going to put a quotation mark around that. And then I'm going to put a quotation on the outside of the period. That way I know I have something. "We can't wait," the students cheered. That looks like it's somebody new talking. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter here. And I'm going to hit the tab key. Actually, put the tab keys over there as well. That way I know that this is a new person talking. And again, I have to make sure I put quotation marks around that as well. That way I can tell that this is what the students actually said. And let's think, well, Mr. Segment Grid, let's get started. Is a new person talking again? So again, I'm going to put quotation marks around what I said. Well, quotation marks, and it looks like I have some interrupted dialogue, which is what that's called. Let's get started is also going to have quotation marks around. So you can see that this is the proper way to do this. So now I want you to try one. The video is going to pause now. It's going to pull up a little box. It's going to ask you to try this on your own. So you'll have to either add quotation marks if they're needed, or add some paragraphing if it's needed. Great, so you probably figured out already that there is two people talking. And we kind of have the example here that shows where you should have the paragraphing. It says, "Kelly said, I want my band shirt back right now. You didn't have permission to borrow it." "No," said Paul, "but you didn't have permission to take my CD shirt either." So we have a new paragraph here where Paul is talking, so we're going to make sure we have a new paragraph where that starts. "But you didn't have permission to take my CD either. I can see that on your desk." Great, so we have our two different lines of dialogue, and they're going to be two separate paragraphs. Now the video is going to pause again, and I want you to try it again. This time you're going to have to add some punctuation and add some quotation marks and also do some paragraphing. So the video is going to pause, and I'm going to have you try that one. Great, now that you have finished that and you've turned all that in, we're going to get back to our independent work time. So what I want you to do is first to open up Google Classroom. Then I want you to make sure you are continuing working on your rough draft of your paper. Again, your paper is due Friday. I'm going to say that a couple times during this. Make sure you have dialogue in your paper. Make sure you have at least 1 or 2 lines of dialogue. If you don't have that, it is going to score you down dramatically. You can make sure you're using what we learned today to make sure your dialogue is formatted correctly. If you are confused or if you have some questions, ask myself. If Miss Miller is in the room, you can ask her, or ask the sub if you have to help you format dialogue. Remember, your rough draft is due Friday. If you're struggling, you don't know what your paper should look like, look at the examples that I have posted in Google Classroom, and it will help you see what it is I'm looking for. Again, your rough draft is due Friday. Next week, we will start to do some editing. Tomorrow, we will talk a little bit about showing and not telling your details. Thank you so much.